Well, happy Tuesday, everyone. I am Norma, the co-facilitator of the Serving Latinx Population group with the lovely Yahaira, who could not be with us today because she is in clinic virtual clinic, which I think is something that all of us can relate to at this moment in time. But I'm very happy to introduce these two lovely folks and this webinar. The SLIP group continues to build content, so if you are interested in adding your voice to this conversation, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Marta, or to Yahaira. So I had the pleasure of meeting Joel in Denver at this past conference when this group to serve Latinx populations was just growing, and Joel was very enthusiastic, extremely helpful, and I'm just so glad that he has made the time to share his expertise with us. He is also the writer of our inaugural blog post, so please check that out. I actually have to hop off on a call for my own virtual clinic, so I'm going to hand things off to Joel and his wonderful friend Emily, who is also a wealth of knowledge. I hope you all really enjoy this webinar and are staying safe and happy and as sane as we all can be at this time. All right, enjoy everyone.
So hi everybody, welcome. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for that introduction, Norma. I imagine you all have been doing a lot of e-meetings lately, so thanks for fitting this into your schedule. One more group of people to look at on squares, right? So I got the introduction already, so I just introduced my role. I'm the Director of Integrated Behavioral Health Services with the health centers that are part of the Philadelphia Department of Public Health. And I also do provide direct BHC services to patients there. And it's definitely part of the work that I enjoy the most. The topics that we're going to discuss today, a lot of this comes from my experience, especially in the past 2 years working with pediatricians and family practitioners with a lot of newcomer immigrants, and really trying to wrap my mind around how to provide good services to that are specific to the unique needs of these folks. I know also that whenever I've attended an in-service or a training, I've always wanted to try to condense the information, and as far as what can I specifically take home with me for these brief interventions that we're all trained in doing or want to be doing. And so I've really tried to make my part really a focus on what kind of tools can you put in to your toolbox when you may just have one visit. Before I get into it, and I also just want to put this out there, I'm really thankful to my friend Emily to join in with us. I'm really excited for what she has to share. I decided that for myself and for others, it felt really strange to prepare myself to do a webinar on a topic that wasn't related to COVID at this point, because it feels like everything we are talking about right now needs to be in this context of COVID is happening and we will continue to feel the effects of this. So because of the amount of possible stress or anxiety that's circling around the general collective conscious, I wanted to invite us all to just take a few centering breaths. So you do that with me. Breathing in. Breathing out, and maybe taking a moment to recognize your own ability to be a peaceful presence to the world around us, even in the middle of so much chaos. And one more deep breath in, deep breath out. Thanks. So, is there a way, I'm actually not seeing the PowerPoint in front of me. Is there a way that I can...
On your screen, I can share it.
Share that.
Second. Okay. I was waiting. I didn't want to take away from. Okay. Sorry, I can't get to the.
That's fine. All right. So actually, one of the things that I wanted to review just now was our objectives, which we do have in the outline that we sent out. But I kind of explained that already. I'd like to, we're going to get into a little bit about what our current situation is regarding the needs of newcomer immigrants, how we kind of got to this situation that we're in right now, what the unique needs are of these communities, specifically Latino newcomer immigrants. Is there a way that you can get my notes out of that? It's kind of like pulling the curtain off, you know?
I know. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, pay no attention to.
Exactly.
Try hitting F5.
Oh. Okay. I'm gonna.
Maybe in display settings.
Maybe
There we
only
go.
we can.
That's good. I have my notes anyway. All right. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Emily for her part.
Okay. Am I on mute? Because I
can hear you.
Oh,
no,
you
you're
can?
good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Sorry. Some of my controls got hidden when I made the screen do its thing. So hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you all for tuning in. And thanks to Joel and the CFHA for having me, Joel for inviting me. I'm going to try to provide a little bit of context and a little, excuse me, bit of background on this particular population, focusing really mostly on newly arrived migrants from Central America, so from the Northern Triangle to the United States. My work focuses heavily on unaccompanied children, but we do also work with children and family units. So that's really the lens that I am coming at this from. I work for an organization called KIND, which is Kids in Need of Defense. We are largely a legal services organization, but also do have some social service coordinators. And I coordinate reintegration services for kids who are returning to their country of origin. And so that's where I'm coming at this from. But I think Joel wanted me to talk a little bit to some of the larger context that these clients or this population is coming from, to try to set the stage for the kinds of background your interventions might be heading into. And so I also want to make the caveat that it's not all bad in Central America, and not everybody is traumatized beyond belief. However, the people who come to you are more likely than others to have experienced some of these challenging circumstances. So just always feel like I need to make that disclaimer. So in the next 12-ish minutes, I'm gonna walk through, take a look at changing trends in migration into the US. Going to do a quick overview of what the current root causes of migration and the push factors out of the region known as the Northern Triangle are. Talk through a little bit of the common psychosocial and health effects that families face, and is going to do a really brief overview of some macro and interdisciplinary considerations for you all. And like Joel said, he's going to really try to offer a set of tools for your toolbox. I'm going to highlight some things that I think are important for you to understand as you meet with these folks, and perhaps educate yourself about more. This is a very, very brief overview, and in the sense that you might only meet with folks for one time, if you think that the things I'm about to talk about if they are affecting your clients, then I encourage you to really look into the resources, the reports that are out there, so that when somebody brings something up, you have that resource in the back of your head to say, oh, maybe we should talk about this. So here we go. Really briefly, hopefully that's big enough for you all, but these are some statistics about Southwest border apprehensions since the 60s till now. The main point of this graph is obviously the major trend in migration. It looks like in the year 2000, they started tracking the different nationalities. Before then, the numbers were just captured all nationalities. And as you can see, overall, since the year 2000, rates of migration and rates of apprehension at the US border have gone down significantly. And what you can see there, though, is the breakdown in that bar graph is that the population is also changing significantly. So while overall numbers of migration have gone down, the proportion of the people arriving at the southwest border are increasingly families and unaccompanied migrant children. So unaccompanied migrant children are kids who come to the US without a parent or legal guardian. In 2014, there is what in the immigration world is known as the surge. And in 2014, that green bar that represents unaccompanied child arrivals represents 40,000 unaccompanied children arrived that year at the southwest border, and it was a crisis for the systems that deal with those kids, and it was the highest number ever recorded. It went down slightly in the years after that, and then this data doesn't show it, but in 2019, 70,000 unaccompanied migrant kids arrived at the southwest border, so almost double what the previous record was in 2014. All that to say is that as we talk about migration into the US from a political standpoint or a psychosocial standpoint or social services standpoint, I think we really need to understand that this idea of like the lone Mexican farm worker from the 80s is not the only person coming to the US anymore. And there are lots of people coming for a variety of different reasons. Some of the root causes of migration, reasons people come, and then things that pose risks to folks along their way. In 2014, that huge increase in unaccompanied kids was largely attributed to an increase in generalized and gang violence throughout El Salvador, Honduras, and somewhat in Guatemala. There continue to be incredibly high levels of violence in all three of those countries. Gang violence is more prevalent in Honduras and El Salvador. Domestic violence and intrafamilial violence continues to be a major factor in communities in Guatemala, compounded by the fact that there are exceedingly high rates of corruption and impunity. So crimes go unreported. The crimes that do get reported aren't investigated. If they are investigated, there aren't arrests or convictions. There are all kinds of reports that detail the difficulty that people have in getting justice, protection, and specialized services if they've been the victim of a crime. Many people who come from the Northern Triangle have lived in chronic extreme poverty and have experienced systemic oppression from their governments. There are repressive governments and weak governments who don't have the capacity to set up social safety nets that we somewhat can rely on here in the US. So the healthcare systems, the child welfare system, all of these things are underdeveloped and stressed to the maximum without even beginning to meet the need that exists in these countries. One thing to keep in mind is that self-identified reasons for migration tend to only be the beginning of the story. And so a lot of times when you look at statistics on reasons for migration, like government published statistics from border interviews or other things, those statistics will often skew towards, I came for a better life, which is then translated into, I came for economic opportunity. But what you get to when you start peeling back those layers can be many, many other factors, including violence and threats and persecution and chronic poverty, chronic extreme poverty. And so it's good to sort of keep in mind that somebody's first statement to you of why they came, to reunify with my mom, or to reunify with my dad, is really only one piece of that story and is worth going into if you have the time and if that's part of the reason you're talking to folks. Migrants in transit really are also particularly vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and having unmet medical or mental health needs. And so anything that they experienced, that made them decide to start the migration journey can be compounded by things that they experienced during the journey. And then obviously the risks and difficulties that they face once they arrive to their final destination. So common psychosocial and health factors families face, I have a whole list of them here. I'm going to go over just a couple, but generally the risk factors that the non-immigrant population faces are faced by migrants and are exacerbated by the fact that if they are undocumented. Obviously not all of them, but the vast majority of arrivals from Central America are undocumented. And so obviously the current political situation in the US and the risk of arrest, separation, deportation can lead to chronic stress and maladaptive behaviors. The normalization of violence in a lot of areas of Central America can lead to the normalization of violence in communities and families here in the US. Prolonged family separations, either the separation that happened several years ago where one parent came to the US and now a teenager is coming to live with their family, not the 6-year-old that was left behind, as well as separations as we saw them in 2018 and continue to see them now, where children are separated from their parent at the border very unexpectedly, and it's a complicated and mysterious process of if and when they'll be reunified. Communities with poor healthcare systems, chronic malnutrition contribute to a lot of really serious medical needs and chronic health needs for this population, as well as undiagnosed mental health concerns that either were pre-existing or have developed as a result of the journey they've undertaken recently. And a really important thing to note is the cyclical nature of violence. People who have been victims of violence in their home countries are more likely to continue to experience, especially to continue to experience domestic violence and intimate partner violence once they get to the US. A couple of considerations, and this page I think is more just to give you some sort of key things to further your own investigation, is increasing collaboration across medical, educational, mental health, and legal services professions really can increase success in all of those areas. Understanding how each of us interacts with this population can be really helpful. In the US, I think that legal status should be considered a basic need, and particularly for those who have experienced violence, abuse, or persecution. So it should always be something you're asking about in terms of just to understand sort of if that's another risk factor that this person has. For some forms of legal relief are available, may be available to people who've experienced crimes or violence. You can look into that. And overall, the US immigration system is very unfriendly to children. We have some protections in place, but we need a lot more. And I've put a couple of links in here for some reading on what protections children specifically have in immigration proceedings. And I've added a couple of things on the last page of the slideshow in terms of resources. So that's my really quick and dirty rundown of a very vast world of immigration and root causes and things. I'm going to turn it over to Joel, and then I'm happy to answer questions at the end of this whole presentation, and always by email later.
All right, thank you. Give me a thumbs up. You can hear me okay? Yes, okay. Wow, thank you, Emily. That was such a wealth of information in a very short amount of time. Awesome. So these are my clinical considerations and possible interventions from a BHC perspective. So I want to say that what I've put together here is from conversations within our medical teams about what's worked well for us. So I'm presenting to you based on that experience. I also gleaned a lot of information and ideas from a resource series of trainings that I did through the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, and those trainings are listed for you to access at the end. It's about 4 hours worth of webinars. So getting into it, this is my spoiler alert. You don't want there to be just be one visit. As Emily reviewed, there's quite a number of immediate health needs that individuals are coming to us with, and to promote engagement and active relationship with the primary care provider and the medical team is really important. So everything that you're doing, you're sort of doing based on this idea of building a closer relationship between the individual and their medical home. So one thing I really like to do before I start one of these visits is to do a self check-in to see what kind of headspace I'm in, just to kind of clear the clutter out of my mind. I think that's really valuable. There's, especially talking to children, it has been really hard for me to hear some of the trauma backgrounds and stories that I hear in a short amount of time. And it sort of ends up feeling like a little bit of a whiplash from some of the other cases that I may have been seeing throughout the day. So just to kind of prepare myself that it may be possible that some hard things will come up, and to trust that the individual has their own set of strengths and resilience that have brought them to this point, and that we can keep building on that. Yeah, so it helps clear out just any anxiety you may have. Doing a chart review is a basic BHC skill. I think we should all be getting used to doing that, but in this case it's especially important because some information you may be able to get there, and avoid having to overwhelm the individual further by asking additional questions. I think sometimes when somebody comes up, they're new to an environment, new to a clinic, not really sure what to expect, and they're getting asked a million questions. The ability to absorb the information goes down as more information is given. So try and lessen the amount of questions you might have to ask somebody by doing a quick chart review. Rapport building and creating a safe space, everything you do from your body posture, the tone of your speech, the speed of your speech, all of that really does a lot to create a safe space for the individual. I think I personally minimizing the potential for interruptions has been really helpful when I'm having a visit with somebody that comes from this population. Just some basic trauma-informed care principles that we don't have a lot of time to get into, but that I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with. But doing a lot of introductions to what you are going to do and why you're going to do it, and explaining what your role is as part of the medical team, I found to be really valuable, and just sort of helping put individuals at ease. They may not know exactly why they're being referred to you, and that's kind of okay. But a basic explanation that you're part of the medical team, that you're here to help them, and you'd like to ask them more questions typically suffices. Also helping them, this is in the slide, but anticipate the direction the visit will take by building on the referral reason can be really helpful. It helps the visit have more of a focus in that regard. Just some other things to help simplify the communication, avoiding stacked questions and being too ambitious with goal setting or the education you're providing. So just a helpful little tidbit that I got from one of these webinars that I was referencing. A lot of times people have a long story to tell, and it's important to keep in mind that the goal isn't necessarily for them to have to tell their whole story. You don't need to hear all of that right there in the visit, but rather to create a space where they could tell their story if they did want to, keeping in mind that behavioral health visits are usually limited in time, but we don't want to feel like cause people to feel a pressure that they need to go into all of a trauma story or a story about, you know, the hardships that they've been through for the sake of assessing further, because that may end up being counterproductive and activating people. Can you pass the next slide, please? Okay. Trying to be mindful of time here. So some things that are helpful in a contextual interview are the country of origin and what their background is, as far as what type of area they came from, whether it was urban or rural. You may be able to find that from a chart review, but I still find that important in terms of building rapport and sort of having an established point of where the patient's narrative begins. I think it helps people feel connected to that you're actually validating that it's not just somewhere down south in Central America, but an actual country. It helps me to know how long they've been in the United States, what their home and family makeup is, and what their support systems are, who is helping them, who they come to be with. Do they have friends, family members, other individuals, organizations, case managers that are helping them? Those are really important to document. keeping in mind what Emily mentioned earlier, that there may be a very complex reason of why they came beyond just their initial stated reason for coming to the United States. Yeah, so I mentioned plans and goals. What are some of the things that they'd like to achieve? They may not be able to state that right in that moment. That's okay, but I think asking it is still important. In terms of clinical assessment, I think all BHCs are very familiar with some of these tools, PHQ-9, G87, PTSD, PC. I think it's appropriate to use those by relevance. If you're getting a referral that's really focused on rule out for major depressive disorder, I think the PHQ-9 is appropriate, making sure to explain to the individual that this is why you're using this tool and what you hope to achieve by that. But I'm not really a big fan of doing these just sort of universally or routinely. Of course, we may have clinic protocols that override that, but I think when the importance of establishing rapport with the individual and being able to connect to them, for me, surpasses the need for just sort of a blanket PHQ-9 or G87 assessment in most cases. There's some sort of obvious things that I think are important to assess for that we're probably all doing in our clinical work: suicide, alcohol, and drug use. It's easy to forget that for many teenagers, it may be normalized for them to drink at an early age. And if we've had a couple of families who the drinking habits of teenagers have continued as they've come to the United States, and it's created a sort of additional layer of legal problems. So that's something that's good to know about. And domestic violence. Don't have time to get into these issues anymore. They could kind of add to their own training. What I'm going to get into next is more along the lines of things that you would do when there isn't a crisis, when there isn't an immediate critical need or a need for a safety planning or something like that. I'll add to important consideration is shame and stigma are very big with mental health issues in general. And added to that, the connection that many individuals from the communities that we're talking about have understandably sort of a suspicion or a fear of any kind of authority, and they may not necessarily make as clear of a distinction about what type of authority they're talking to. So definitely an importance to building a safety, a sense of connection with the individual, explain that you're there to help them, and being mindful in the way you're asking questions about that are mental health related, by offering ongoing assurance through the visit that you're there to help them, can help sort of ease that sort of shame and stigma. All right, next slide. And I'm going to take a quick sip of water. So when I mentioned earlier that I really like to just kind of get into it, and a lot of times when I've listened to webinars, I've really wanted to get some of the real practical take-home stuff. What can I be doing in BHC interventions? These are a list of the tools that I think have really worked well for me, and I want to share them. So being really strength-based, I think we're all trained in doing that in mental health, but values and motivation-based coping mantras to have people develop on and repeat to themselves throughout the day, phrases to come back to in moments of anxiety or distress, can be very valuable. And the good thing is that this is building on coping skills that a lot of people have already utilized or depended on. Some of these may be phrases that they've been taught by family members, or that are more from popular culture, or that may come from a song. In some case, they're spiritually based, but really having people repeat these in the visit and encouraging them on the value of repeating these things to them when they're in moments of distress can be very valuable. And it really connects with people. If you're not a Spanish language speaker, you may not be able to understand sort of the nuances of what this, why a patient may connect to one of the mantras that they're speaking of, or one of the ones that they identify. But so asking them a little bit more about why this is helpful, why this is important, can be of value. Psychoeducation is a big one. And in a couple specific areas, I'll talk on psychoeducation in a couple specific areas. So explaining and normalizing trauma responses is very valuable and important, along with assurance that you will be there to support them in the process. What kind of resources they can expect from you, what kind of support they can expect from you in the process. So not just saying, oh, this is normal, you're going to keep going through that, but this is normal, and while it may be affecting your functioning now, we hope to continue supporting you so that you can cope and deal with this better. So there's different levels of this: family, individual, parent. As Emily touched on, the ACEs score of a lot of the families and individuals that we're talking with are very high. And a lot of these individuals may feel that this is sort of like a baseline normality, may have become accustomed to it. And this can create a dynamic sometimes when with children that have experienced trauma, if the parents have also experienced this, it's important, it can be helpful and valuable to remind the family that this, what the effects of this are, and why developing some stress and coping mechanisms around trauma reactions can be really helpful. But when I'm referred a patient who is a child, a lot of times, or most of the time, I'll say it's essentially necessary for me to meet with the parent also to do a little bit of explaining about why that response may have happened. And sometimes getting into a little bit more with the parent to helping them get to a point of empathy for the child. Many times I think just their own stress kind of creates a barrier to them being able to connect to their kids and empathize. So asking some questions like, can you remember having gone through this yourself? Can you see what this could be like for them, can really help sort of build a stronger bond and attachment. That's really a protective factor. Just checking on the time here. If it's not in here, I did want to add that when there is family reunification, really helping families develop some just routines and activities, identifying places to go, things that can help sort of rebuild connection between parents and children, and also as a protective factor against other stressors, just to be able to have time to de-stress with enjoyable or entertaining activity, play, etc. Taking a narrative therapy-based approach, I think, is something that a lot of Latino individuals connect very well with, sort of helping them tell their story by with strengths-focused questions such as, what's motivating you, what do you value, what's important to you, what's gotten you through the hard times. Can you find yourself in a place? Can you tell your story in the framework as an individual who didn't give up, or doesn't give up, or was able to overcome hardship? I think that can be very empowering to people. I have very basic conversations with the kids and families about school and community integration, just basics of like, what's the name of your school? When does it start? What's that going to be like for you? How are you getting to school? Just consider the amount of adjustment that individuals are having to make when they come to a new place. It can help really sort of mentally rehearse what the adjustments they're going to have to make are. This is a concept I learned a while ago, cultural interpreters. Who are the people that you can go to when you're like, hey, I don't know how this thing works. I go to the supermarket and I don't know how the purchase works. That's different. Help them identify those folks that they can go to for just information on the basics. Many of them will have them already, but it can be a helpful thing to review. Sleep interventions, I won't get too much into that, but I've noticed that sleep problems are common when individuals immigrate. Something that has worked really well is white noise and nature sounds, especially for people that lived in rural areas and just really find it relaxing to hear the sound of rain. There's a lot of YouTube videos of raindrops falling on tin roofs, and people love those. So I just wanted to make sure to put that in there. Appropriate use of cell phones. I end up talking about this a lot with teenagers and families because kids really connect to the cell phones. And I think that it's a tricky subject because I think it is appropriate for kids to have an outlet and entertainment, and it's a way for them to stay connected to friends and family back home at the same time. Consider when it may be a hindrance to other important developmental tasks such as play and developing relationships, etc. So yeah, helping families find a balance with that, especially as it pertains to sleep disruption. Okay. When it comes to mental health and specialty referrals, I'm very fortunate to have a couple options here in Philadelphia, places to refer to. But keep in mind that the concept of counseling and seeing a psychologist may be very foreign to individuals. So basic statements such as, meeting with somebody to talk about what you've been through can be really helpful, or especially giving examples of that it's been helpful to other individuals that have been in similar situations. I like to talk to people a lot about the basics of it. How often will you be going? What will be the way of transportation that you'll use to get there? Childcare, etc. Those things sort of help people be more prepared to do it, as opposed to just giving people a number or something that isn't as doesn't facilitate that as well. It is really simple. I really always confirm people's contact information because it changes a lot. So in the interest of staying connected to your medical home, I tend to do that regularly. Talking about what the health center processes and workflows are helps reinforce and orientate them to the health systems. Collaborative care planning that is referring to just the communication, feedback, and teamwork that you give to the primary care providers, explaining to them what you do. Again, it's an essential BHC skill, but because of the amount of risk and psychosocial issues, there's an additional need to sort of reinforce that, like, oh, this is what we're going to do with this family. This is who's going to reach out to them. This is how often when they're going to be coming back next. We all agree. So. In the last bullet, psychoeducation and planning focused on strengthening bonding and attachment. Okay, that's something I reviewed earlier. All right. So, Emily, I think you might have had a few more things to add in there.
No, I went ahead. We had initially put the macro stuff here at the end, and I went ahead and just included those in my first little spiel. So,
okay, right. Okay. Well, I kind of zoomed through that. We might have a little bit more time for questions than I had anticipated. I think the last thing I would add in there is just really the importance of self-care. It can be really challenging to hear some of the stories, the violence, the trauma, the lack of access to just essential needs that people live with. And while I think that cognitively we're all aware that these things are happening, actually experiencing it firsthand can be especially challenging. I hope that some of the things that I'm offering here help you feel a little bit more empowered, because it's true that you may just have one visit with somebody. And so giving something tangible for somebody to work on and sort of help them take that next step can be really valuable. But yeah, just knowing within yourself, asking yourself the question, what are the signs that I'm just not in a good headspace? Is it thinking too much about patients when you go home? Is it sleep disruption? Is it avoidance? Is it feeling stressed out or, acting out to other members of your team? Try and identify and this is obviously general self-care principles, but really try and identify to yourself, what are the things that are, if you're finding yourself sort of resistant or uncomfortable to these type of visits, really try and identify those triggers and make sure to sort of like shore up the self-care efforts when those things are happening. Because obviously secondary trauma is real also. So should I go through this last slide here real quick? Okay, so this is the last bit and then we'll open it up for questions. National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, I think they're a great organization and I've used a lot of the materials that they have and resources that they have on their website. We've adapted a few of them to use as handouts or just printed them directly to give as handouts to patients and families. They're just basic psychoeducational material on traumatic stress and on an adjustment. This webinar series I really wanted to highlight. If you want to know more about the kind of things that we're talking about, I really want to encourage you to check out these webinars. A lot of them are a little bit more focused on doing some more intensive therapy practice, not on primary care behavioral health, but the principles still apply. Just a couple other things from Philadelphia that you might want to check out that have some resources or just ideas of the type of work that's happening here in Philadelphia to help these communities. The Philadelphia Alliance for Child Trauma Services is doing a lot of cross-systems collaboration to support these communities, recognizing that Philadelphia is seeing a lot of families in need that are newcomer immigrants. La Puerta Abierta, the Open Door, is a really awesome organization. I don't think they have much in their website as far as resources, but the work that they're doing is really valuable to us, and we refer a lot of people for counseling there. And the Executive Office for Immigration Review is Emily's resource. I'll let you touch on that.
Yeah, so that is, at the very least, if you have clients that you are looking to help get connected to legal assistance, this is for children and adults. The Executive Office for Immigration Review is who runs the immigration courts, but they have a state-by-state list of free and low-cost immigration legal service providers on this website. So no matter which state you're in, you can go on here on that site and click and see who the free and low-cost legal service providers are for immigration court in your area. I will give a plug to my earlier slide where I think I had 2 hyperlinks to some information around the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, and the Flores settlement, both of which are really instrumental in terms of protections and rights of immigrant children in particular. Those 2 links that I included are specifically to resources developed by my organization. We do a lot of policy and communications work. So if you are interested in understanding sort of what the current political reality is and the impacts that that has on children and families, please feel free to use my organization's website as a jumping off point for resources. I am biased, but I do think we have some really incredible resources for folks who don't, who are just getting into really understanding what the heck is going on the legal end. So, or people who already know what's going on the legal end and still can't make sense of it. But yeah, I'll try to think through and see if I have some more resources, or if there are other resources that folks would be interested in seeing included here, but that we don't have in terms of this population. Let us know, and we can maybe add a few more things before we send it out to the group.
Great, Joel and Emily, this has been great information. I love the word, for me to learn it was a cultural interpreters. I guess I never heard that term before. It sounds so appropriate because for this particular population, a lot of the times they're just struggling with how to navigate what we feel it's the basic information here in the United States. For example, the school system for parents, and a lot of times it can be very obvious for us, but for parents who are immigrants, it's really hard for them to connect with the school system. And I love the idea of helping them connect somebody that's called like the cultural interpreters that can help them navigate things that for us can be so obvious. We have here a comment from David Rain, which is, what a fantastic webinar. Thank you for generously sharing this very important information and resources. It is an act of love and advocacy to shine in bright light on the needs of these marginalized and often invisible groups. I also have here a comment from Lacona Simmons, very helpful info, thank you. I imagine patients appreciate speaking to someone who is fluent in their native language, have patients communicate to you their experience with using an interpreter? I know interpreters are necessary, but was curious if you heard feedback from patients about this.
I have an excellent plug here to give you. There is another webinar that was offered about a month ago by Florencia Levinson Chialvo called Somos Complicados, and I would point you to that. It was through the CFHA webinar series. So Somos Complicados, meaning we're complicated. And it is, I forget what the subtitle is, but it's essentially a review of the Latinx population in the United States and what the common needs are. So she does a review of this, and research showed, for what she presented was that research shows that there isn't as much of a, so how did she put it? As far as coming from a similar background, so ethnic match was not as important, but there is more importance. There is a higher sort of rate of connection between the individual receiving services and the person receiving them when there is a native Spanish speaker. However, not significant that it is a barrier. So I think the ideal is always to have somebody who is fluent or bilingual. But I'm definitely an advocate of, try to learn a little bit of Spanish. Try and learn the basic greetings, learn the days of the week, learn maybe your BHC intro. That really does a lot to break down barriers. So yeah, I'll point you to that webinar for more information, but I think that's kind of where I would go with that.
I want to jump on there and just make a plug, because I understand that this group of people is sort of all over the country, and some of you may be living in areas where there's a high concentration of, sorry, there's some sadness outside the door. A high concentration of indigenous Guatemalans or folks from southern Mexico as well, but people from Mayan communities. And I can try to put some of these things on the resources page, but La Liga Maya is an organization that was founded in the 80s that really worked to organize and disseminate information amongst different Mayan communities who had relocated to the US. And I think there is some work currently on building a network of Mayan interpreters across the country that can help for these kinds of things. And so I don't really expect many of you who don't already speak a Mayan language to learn one, but I think that is really important to recognize that, particularly with Guatemalan folks who come from Guatemala, Spanish may not even be their first language. So keep it in mind.
Great. One of the questions I heard often, it's for those providers who feel this sense of competency when they're working with English-speaking patients, and then they work with Spanish-speaking patients, and they feel this kind of lack of, I'm not going to say competency, but they feel just not as comfortable as working with English-speaking patients. What will you suggest them or guide them when they're really trying their best to help the patient, but they, from their point of view, they feel insecure about how well they're working with a Spanish-speaking patient, even though if they have an interpreter, but they feel it's different because they're afraid that maybe they're missing some cultural issues, or they don't feel as secure as treating an English-speaking patient. Any advice that you can give to them?
A few things come to mind, Emily. But Emily, do you have anything to add to this?
I'm not a clinician, so I always have thoughts. So I'm going to share a couple and then let you, Joel. But I think my first is that that you need to just have that same confidence that you are still the same professional, you still have a lot to offer, and that this is still an important service, but also just encourage folks to really familiarize themselves culturally with the region that the majority of their non-English speaking folks are coming from. So if you are in fact working with populations who are mostly Central American, watch some foreign movies, read some translated foreign newspapers, read, not like from Spain, because that's not the same thing. So, so just kind of get some cultural immersion. That's fun, because there's plenty of things that you can kind of take a look at that will help you really understand where folks are coming from, or develop one of those shared starting points, like Joel said, like, oh, I can't think of a one that's not inappropriate off the top of my head, but those are some of my sort of thoughts. I don't know, Joel, what you probably have more relevant things to say to clinicians.
So I'm actually a native Spanish speaker myself. I was born and grew up in Lima, Peru, and I do feel that I'm able to offer an additional layer of insight because of the native language connection with other individuals. And I find other providers feel a little bit insecure about that. But what I often find myself, and I'm thinking of two pediatricians specifically, is that if you're starting from a place of humility and the place of, I want to be a learner here, and I want to offer you what I can, you're on the right track. I think just kind of checking in for those points of burnout when you feel overwhelmed and you start to feel like, oh, there's nothing I can do because the needs are just so great. I think that's sort of a sign that you're going on the wrong track. You're not going to be able to solve everybody's problems, but you do, and sort of trying to help providers shift their focus towards that. I found to be really valuable. Some of them come in sort of have little mini sessions with me sometimes, and that's okay. But that's what I would say to that. I think if you're asking yourself those types of questions, you're just on the right track, and knowing that you're a small piece of like a bigger what's going to be needed for the bigger picture of healing for individuals and families. And also, I came to this health center 2 years ago, and I've made connection with a lot of the patients there, but some of the pediatricians have been seeing these like families and kids for years, and their Spanish hasn't necessarily become fluent, but man, they have a really good connection with people. And just that relationship is incredibly valuable. So I think that would be the number one protective factor, I think, in providing support with people more than language.
Yeah, and I'll just second that, Joel, and add that I think a key tenet of cultural humility is seeing every interaction you have with every patient as a cross-cultural interaction. So instead of seeing some people as having an advantage and others people as at a disadvantage, I think everyone starts off, if you're starting from a standpoint of cultural humility, from a point of being a learner, and seeing the cultural components of that interaction uniquely versus making assumptions about it. So practically speaking, I am half Puerto Rican, half Colombian, born in the United States in New York City to immigrant parents. So when I walk into any situation, even though I'm fluent in the language, have good cultural knowledge, I have to walk into every exam room with a sense of curiosity about where this person's from, what their history is, as Emily so well put, some of the factors that led them to come here, some of the social components of their story that are proximal, that need addressing. So I've learned, and in some ways, because I think what my background helps me to do is helps me to understand the nuance of that. Much the same way, if you're a white American, you know that being white in the South and white in the Midwest are very different things. So I have a nuance. I understand that being from Mexico City and being from somewhere on the coast of Mexico or rural Mexico is very, very different. So it's not that I know everything there is to know about that person. I just know that I don't know. And that makes me start off from a point of curiosity and wanting to hear the context of that person's story. So I appreciated, Joel, when you said simple things like asking where they're from. So I don't know the map of Mexico terribly well, but I always ask my Mexican patients when they tell me that they have recently immigrated or from a certain place, I say, so where are you from? And I try to ask them like, and it's amazing how much just a little bit of.
And I think we lost you a little bit at the end, but Neftali was saying like what part of Mexico they're coming from exactly, and explain more the town of where they're coming from. So, well, I have been really enjoying all the information you both have giving us, Emily and Joel. I hope all our listeners are also enjoying all this. We will also be posting this webinar for those who couldn't make it today. Anything else you want to add for our last minutes here?
I don't have anything, but thank you so much for being willing to have us talk.
This was great. Thank you so much for your time. Be safe, everyone out there, and thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you all.